Thank you, Justin. I join Justin in welcoming all of you today. We recognize that your time is a valuable thing, so we're grateful that you're spending it with us. Uh, it's a pleasure to very briefly introduce our extraordinary faculty. You'll find biographical links for each of them in the chat. You'll also find more information about Berkeley Judicial Institute. To make a long story short, now that we have you here, we'd love to have you back. Our moderator today is retired Judge Brett Alldredge, who has served as a California Superior Court judge. He is a gift that keeps on giving to Berkeley Judicial Institute, suggesting interesting programs like the one we're involved in today. In his judicial service, he was assigned to the criminal division for his last 15 years, with primary responsibility for pretrial, mental health diversion, and drug court. So you'll know why he's interested in these important topics. Dr. Jan Ludwig is the Edwin A. and Betty L. Bergman Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. He's the Pritzker Director of the University of Chicago's Crime Lab. He's co-director of the National Bureau of Economic Research Working Group on Economics of Crime, and so much more. In 2007, he moved to the south side of Chicago to research two big questions. Why does gun violence happen? And is there anything we can do about it? How's that for a start? As Justin mentioned, please feel free to put your questions during the conversation in the chat. The faculty will handle questions toward the end of the program. And please let us know whether you'd like me to ask the question for you or if you'd rather go off to unmute yourself to ask your questions yourself. So with all of that as background, Judge Alldredge, where will we start today?
Good afternoon to you all, and thank you, Denise. I cannot recall a time in my life when reading a great book based upon behavioral economics wasn't a thrill, a reveal, a feeling of this explains everything. Freakonomics, nudge, outliers, thinking fast and slow. They all may address a different reality, but what they all have in common is an invitation to suspend what you think to be true and consider what the data is actually telling us. Now we have a work that offers the same invitation to all of those who think they are certain why violent crimes are committed by identifiable groups of people in identifiable places. This book contains multitudes. I've read it twice, first fast and then slow. It's a fabulous work for many reasons, but the fundamental one, from one who toiled in the criminal justice system for decades, is exposing the fallacy on which all retributive justice is based. There are simply a great number of people, the other, if you will, who act instrumentally. In other words, commit acts of horrific violence after weighing both the costs and the punishment of doing so. Once you adopt that narrative, the only response is to increase the pain inflicted by the state in longer and longer punishments, as if the difference between 10 years and 20 years would matter. On behalf of Jeremy Fogel and Denise Neary, Professor Jans Ludwig, welcome to BJI.
Thank you so very much, Judge, for having me and to everybody for attending.
The graphics on the book, quite frankly, are great. There's even a map of South Chicago on the inside and back covers for those of us who are seemingly always reading about some horrendous gun crime last weekend located somewhere in South Chicago. I believe that you told me that from your office window at the University of Chicago, you can actually see into two separate neighborhoods of South Shore and Greater Grand Crossing. Why is one place separated from the other only by Dorchester Avenue, relatively more or less forgiving than the other?
Yeah, thank you, Judge, for the question. Let me Maybe let me start off by describing why the question you raise itself is such a puzzle before turning to what the explanation might be. So, I have a confession, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a judge. I can barely spell JD myself. I was trained as an economist a million years ago. And, when I moved to the University of Chicago in 2007, from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., I had a bunch of ideas in my head about what drives crime and gun violence in America that I think are very consistent with what the survey data suggest most Americans think drives crime and gun violence in America. So when you look at the surveys, what you see is that almost all Americans, when you ask them what causes crime and violence, almost all Americans fall into one of two camps. These are not exactly mutually exclusive, but most people wind up falling into one of these two camps. So a bunch of Americans say that crime and gun violence are due to morally bad people who just are not afraid of whatever the criminal justice system is threatening them with. And that perspective on the problem leads you to conclude that the only thing that you can do to address the gun violence problem is to threaten people with ever bigger criminal justice sticks. Most of the Americans who don't ascribe to that view tend to fall into a second camp, who say that crime and gun violence is due to economic desperation, that it's due to people who are doing whatever it takes to feed their family, put food on the table. And that perspective leads you to think that the only thing that you can do to disincentivize gun violence is to make the alternatives to crime, that is job programs, the social safety net, more lucrative as a way to steer people away. And both of those perspectives, they lead to very different sort of policy prescriptions, but notice that both of those conventional wisdoms, which I arrived in Chicago believing myself, both of those conventional wisdoms imply that before anybody pulls a trigger, they are very carefully and deliberately comparing the benefits and costs or pros and cons of whatever they're about to do, which is another way to say that the implicit assumption is that gun violence is very premeditated and deliberate and rational, one might even say. And I think the most important thing that I've learned in the 18 years that I've lived in Chicago is that that's not what most gun violence seems to be. And Judge, now getting to your question, the comparison of the South Shore neighborhood and Greater Grand Crossing here on the south side of Chicago was my introduction, my wake-up moment to realize how little conventional wisdom really can tell us about the gun violence problem. And so if you look at South Shore and you look at Greater Grand Crossing, you'll notice, for starters, that they're located in exactly so it's Dorchester Avenue separates them. On one side of the street, up to the east, it's South Shore. To the west side, it's Greater Grand Crossing. Both of those neighborhoods are located in the city of Chicago. They're served by the exact same Chicago Police Department. They're both located within Cook County. They're served by the exact same Cook County prosecutor, Cook County public defender, Cook County court system. And people sentenced by that court system served their time at the very same Illinois Department of Criminal Justice, Department of Corrections, rather, excuse me. So the entire criminal justice apparatus is exactly the same east of Dorchester Avenue as west. So differences in what the criminal justice system are doing can't possibly explain why the shooting rate per capita is literally twice as high west of Dorchester Avenue and Greater Grand Crossing than east and South Shore. The fact that these two neighborhoods are in exactly the same city, the same county, the same state also implies that gun laws can't explain why shootings are twice as high on one side of the street than the other. And it also turns out that the demographic composition of these two neighborhoods is almost identical, and the economic composition of these two neighborhoods are almost identical. So the most common root causes that people tend to point to, poverty, racial segregation, social isolation, look exactly the same on one side of the street and versus the other. And so I think the motivation for writing the book was seeing that gun violence is so important for the city of Chicago, but not just Chicago. It's the number one issue for so many cities around the country. And then looking across these two neighborhoods and realizing that the conventional wisdom explains so little of what's going on.
I talked at the beginning about the sort of intellectual curiosity or thrill in looking at this type of issue through the lens of a behavioral economist. Um, can you tell us about how the actual murder data that is collected by the FBI bursts the notion um, that a careful look at 20 years of United States murder data collected by them concluded that only 23% of all murders were instrumental. 77% of murders, nearly 4 out of every 5, came out of some kind of argument, a beef, so to speak. And you have some wonderful, I'm gonna say anecdotes, but stories that you start the book with, etc. That's really where this book hooks me and hooks the readers. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, so the first light bulb moment for me in arriving in Chicago was to see these two neighborhoods that look so similar, and yet are so different with respect to the gun violence problem. How much more is going on? The second light bulb moment for me was, we started my research center here at the University of Chicago, the Crime Lab, after a doctoral student in chemistry was shot and killed 2 weeks after defending his doctoral dissertation. And that led to a lot of people at the University of Chicago. We like to go around saying we've won more Nobel Prizes than any other university in the world. People at the University of California, Berkeley might question our numbers, but let's say that we're very close in that category. Both universities are extremely distinguished in that regard, but nonetheless, the University of Chicago has won a lot of Nobel Prizes, and yet, this doctoral student was shot and killed literally a block off campus. So we're not having impact literally in our own backyard. What can we do to be more helpful? And so we locked my friend Harold Pollack, who helped me start the crime lab, in the basement of the Chicago Police Department headquarters at 35th and Michigan here on the south side of Chicago. And I said, we said, Harold, don't come out until you've read every homicide case file that involves an offender or a victim under 18. And Harold came back after a week and said, I think these murders are not what we think. And I said, Harold, what do you mean? And Harold said, I think the media representation that has shaped all of our thinking about the gun violence problem is wrong. It's not giving us a representative picture of the problem. And I think that was another really big insight for me in understanding the problem. So in the city of Chicago, when I reflect on what the local news fixates on, every time there is a big federal racketeering case against one of the city's drug gangs, a drug gang on the west side of Chicago that's been responsible for 20 murders in, ongoing feuds about drug selling turf off the heroin highway along the Eisenhower Expressway, that is plastered on the front page of the Chicago Tribune for weeks at a time. And this also is what dominates media. Everybody has seen The Wire, right? And the other sort of shooting that dominates the news headlines in Chicago, and I think not just in Chicago, is gun murders that involve robberies, because the victims are often so unusual. We had a master's student in statistics who was shot and killed at the University of Chicago tragically a few years ago. That was a literally a global news story when that happened. And what we realized when Harold went into the basement of the Chicago Police Department is the overwhelming majority of shootings, unfortunately, turn out to be not newsworthy in the judgment of the news writers themselves. They are, as the judge says, garden variety arguments that go sideways and end in tragedy because someone's got a gun. And those are not newsworthy in the same way. But understanding that, so we don't, our picture is distorted from the media information that we get, but understanding that is so important for the reason that Judge Alldredge mentioned. So if you think about gang wars over drug selling turf, or if you think about murders that are the result of gun robbery, the violence in that case is a means to some larger end, right? The violence there is a means towards capturing some drug selling corner or getting the victim's property or something. And if you think about violence in an argument, the violence is the end. The violence is the point. You are in an argument and you are extremely pissed off at another human being. And in that moment, all you are thinking is that I want to inflict, your thinking is no more sophisticated than I want to inflict violence on this other person. It's a very emotional, not rational kind of event. And that is not when any of us, if you sort of think about the last time that you were really seeing red yourself, that is not when we are all thinking in a benefit cost rational sort of way. And so, one way to think about this is that our policies for at least 100 years, if you look at the criminal justice debate in the United States, you can go back to the 1930s and see the presidential candidates back then arguing about whether the solution is a tougher criminal justice system or worrying about root causes. So we've basically been having the same argument for 100 years, and it's all been about incentives. Should we be changing carrots? Should we be changing the sticks that people face? We've been misdiagnosing what the behavior itself is that we're trying to change. And I think, that has really led me to then start to think, what is going on? We need a very different way to understand that behavior if we're then going to think about what the right policies are to change it, and then judge that, Alldredge, that leads to your point about behavioral economics.
Is it fair to argue that we've been trying or pretending to try to stop violent crime and violent offenders without making any real attempt to understand what is going on in the mind of the violent offenders themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the challenge is that we have not recognized how non-representative our picture of the gun violence problem is. Right. I think so. I think that has lulled us all. It certainly lulled me. I'll only speak for myself. I won't speak for others. It certainly lulled me into thinking that I understood the mind of the offenders, because I've seen The Wire and I've read literally every Chicago Tribune article about, the latest RICO case against some, mass murdering drug gang in Chicago, or, a horrible robbery gone wrong. I thought I understood the problem perfectly. And it's only when we went one level down and started to look at the raw homicide case files that I realized, and to be sure, there are actually cases like that, right? There are actually cases like that, but they only account for, as you said, Judge, when you look across the country, those sorts of so-called instrumental causes for murder, where the violence is a means to some other end. Those are something like 20% of all the murders that happen in the US, as best we can tell. And something like 3/4 to 80% of the murders that happen are not crimes of profit, but rather crimes of passion, recognizing that rage is one of the most powerful human passions. And I think once you recognize that, that's the thing, I think, then that leads you to realize, I thought I understood. It's not that we never asked the question, it's that we thought we had the question answered. And now you just need a very different kind of way of thinking about what is going through someone's head when they are seeing red. They're not doing a benefit cost calculation. What are they doing instead, and what might we do about that?
For the benefit of those who don't know who Daniel Kahneman was and his theory of thinking fast and slow, could you please explain that somewhat and tell us how it plays into your thesis in the book?
Yeah, so I think that the key that unlocks, for me, people should see if they're persuaded by this conversation. If they're so inclined, they should read the book and see if they're persuaded by the argument in the book. But I think I have convinced myself that the key to really understanding what people are doing in these like seeing red moments is an insight from behavioral economics that I think is one of the most important insights about human behavior of the last like 50 or 100 years. And the key insight is, so it's wonderfully summarized in this incredible book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow. I can't recommend it highly enough to all of you. I think it's a life-changing book that will change the way that you see yourself and other people and see the world. And it summarizes the lessons of behavioral economics that basically show us that our minds work, all of us, all of our minds work in a way that is radically different from what we think. We think of thinking as the little voice in our head, right? What is 2 plus 2? It's 4. What is 7 times 14? Oh, I got to do a little, what am I going to have for dinner tonight? What do I need to go by the grocery store on the way? Like that little voice in our head gives us the capacity to be rational to the extent to which we are rational. It's that little voice in our head. Psychologists and behavioral economists call that slow thinking or system 2 thinking. It's very, very powerful. That's what allows us to invent the internet, to develop advanced societies and cities, and and on and on and on, to put a man on the moon. But that sort of deliberate voice in our head thinking, it's very, very powerful, but it is incredibly mentally taxing. And so, if you've ever, if you're a crossword puzzle fan, you will be familiar with this feeling. Like you do 15 minutes of the crossword and you're just mentally exhausted. You've got to take a break for a couple minutes, right? That exhaustion that you experience speaks to how energy intensive and mental bandwidth intensive, like real thinking is, or slow thinking. And because that's so mentally exhausting, all of us have developed a second type of thinking that we're not aware of at all. And it's a series of, it's called fast thinking or system 1 thinking. It all happens below the level of consciousness, so we're not aware of it. And it consists of a series of automatic responses that are designed to be useful for situations that we see over and over again in our daily lives. And so we develop these automatic responses that we do without even thinking about it, without being aware of it. They're fast, effortless. They try and make sense of the world as quickly as system 1 fast thinking can, as using whatever snippets of information happen to be right in front of us. That's hugely beneficial to us because it conserves our mental bandwidth for non-routine things that we have to deal with. But there is a price for that fast, effortless thinking, and it comes in terms of reduced accuracy. This is to say that system 1 sometimes makes mistakes. And I think the really, really important key insight of behavioral economics is not just that our minds sometimes make mistakes because we're acting quickly and effortlessly. It's that there's some predictability to the types of mistakes that we make. And once you understand that this fast thinking is happening, it's implicated in a much larger share of gun violence than we had expected. And there is some commonality to the sort of fast thinking mistakes that people make, then you can start to get some leverage, I think, over understanding exactly what is driving some of these shootings and what you might do about it. And I think one of the key things that I do in the book, Judge Alldredge, you can tell me if you think this is effective or not, but one of the key things that I try and do in the book to emphasize that this is not a particular type of thinking that is unique to any particular group, but it's really universal to all of us. I think the key thing that distinguishes us is not the sort of fast thinking mistakes we make, but the consequences of those fast thinking mistakes that result because of the differences in the situations that we're in. So some people find themselves in much more unforgiving situations. And so I use myself as an example of the sort of common mistakes that we make, and to highlight, I was lucky in making these mistakes in a forgiving situation, but there are a lot of 16-year-old kids on the south and west sides of Chicago who are in less forgiving situations. And so the same sort of mistake I make leads me to be embarrassed and have an embarrassing story to tell, but leads somebody else to wind up dead and somebody else to be spending 60 years downstate in the Illinois Department of Corrections.
Well, I'm glad for myself that you self-admitted, because I didn't know how I was going to work in the conversation. You're very honest self-admissions that happened to you and by you in just the ordinary act of living, walking your dog or driving your car, and those types of things. You repeat several times in the book that gun violence equals the necessity of guns plus violence at the same time. Is it fair to say a reader of your book may conclude that you're conceding that the United States is unlikely to ever adopt effective gun control? And if so, is it fair to describe perhaps the entire United States as an unforgiving place as compared to other democratic societies that don't have anywhere near the kind of gun violence that we experience?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with the characterization that the widespread gun prevalence in the United States. So guns are used for self-defense by people all the time, all across the country. But on net, widespread gun availability winds up making interpersonal conflict much more deadly. So that's the net effect. Even though people are sometimes using guns for self-defense, the effect of guns to make violence more deadly winds up dominating that. And so having 400 million guns, like people in America are not much more likely than people in the UK to get into arguments. The reason that our murder rate is so much higher than their murder rate is that we have 400 million guns in a country of 330 million people, and they have far, far, far fewer guns. And so that's a big part of our problem. I think, I don't think that I'm engaging in any sort of unusual prescient sort of political forecasting to think that big changes in gun laws at the federal level are not happening, or not likely to happen anytime soon, for better or for worse, depending on your politics, right? And it's also true that, these guns, unlike drugs, guns are a durable good, right? These 400 guns are not going to be smoked tomorrow and all go away, or injected tomorrow, or snorted tomorrow, or whatever. And so the gun stock within however many months or years or whatever is going to disappear. These 400 million guns are going to be with us for years and decades, right? And so this is not an argument to say that people shouldn't be thinking about what the right set of gun laws are for the United States and pushing for whatever they think the right direction should be in that area. But it is a very strong argument to think that we should not be putting all of our eggs into the gun control basket. And the good news is, because gun violence is guns plus violence, if the United States is frozen in terms of its gun policy for the foreseeable future, the optimistic news is that there's something else that we can do in the short term to make dramatic changes in the gun violence problem, which is reduce the willingness of people to use these readily available guns to hurt other people. And so, I don't want to discourage anybody from the importance of thinking about gun laws. You should think about this as additive. There's a bunch of other things that we can do that I think don't get talked about nearly as much that are very, very politically feasible, and I think can make a really big difference in short order.
Your book really effectively speaks to what I'll refer to as violent crime interveners. You quote Jane Jacobs as writing, quote, "The informal social control contributed vitally to public safety by interrupting criminal and violent acts in the moment." Can you tell us a little bit about the work of Jane Jacobs and what she was able to identify as interveners of place?
Yeah. Let me tell the story of Jane Jacobs, if I may, through an embarrassing story about myself. And as you alluded to, Judge, not everybody has read the book, and so they have not seen this particularly embarrassing story about me. So I'll just share it very quickly. Every Wednesday morning, I lived in Hyde Park, the neighborhood on the south side of Chicago that's home to the University of Chicago. I lived there for 18 years. I run a research center here called the University of Chicago Crime Lab. Every Wednesday morning at 6:30 in the morning, I would have my weekly leadership call with the top leadership team of my research center. I would leash up my 65-pound hound dog German Shepherd mix named Aiko. She's the sweetest dog in the world. She's very clearly a lover, not a fighter. I leash her up. I put on my running shoes. I put in my headset and patch in the leadership team, and off I go. So one morning, I'm walking around Hyde Park, and I hear the most blood-curdling barking and snarling. And I turn and I see a giant dog off leash racing down a driveway in Hyde Park towards my dog. And I think one of the things that I learned from that experience is that nature designed dogs to look absolutely petrifying when they want to look petrifying. Like fangs bared, spit flying, barking, like furiously running down the driveway at. Now, if all of us were only engaged in slow system to deliberate rational thinking, what I would have done is I would have realized that surely this was not deliberate on the part of the dog owner. This must have been an accident for the dog to slip their leash. I also would have realized that the owner of that dog was another University of Chicago faculty member, and in fact, had a kid in my kid's grade at school. So this is a person who is in my neighborhood, works at my same place of employment. I'm going to see them in the potluck at school for the next however many years. The last thing in the world that I want to do is get into an argument with this guy. But if you've ever seen like a dog off leash racing towards you, you experience an adrenaline dump. And what that adrenaline dump does is it robs you of whatever mental bandwidth that you have in the moment. Deliberate thinking is very bandwidth intensive. You go through an adrenaline dump, like rational thinking is out the window. You are behaving automatically in that moment. And I did something in that moment that is very common to everybody's sort of fast thinking, and I engaged in something called catastrophizing. System one, our fast thinking selves have developed over time to take stock of the situation that we're in very quickly below the level of consciousness. And to do that very quickly and effortlessly, our fast thinking selves consider only one of two possible states of the world. Are things fine, or is this the end of the world? Right? It's not, our fast thinking selves are not like deliberating through like what state of the world is it on some continuum of a million possible options. It's just like, it's very black or white thinking, like totally fine or totally horrible. And in that moment when this dog is coming after my dog, my fast thinking self concluded that this is not fine. And because this is not my deliberate self, this is my automatic fast thinking self. If it's not totally fine, there's only one alternative, which is the end of the world. And if it's going to be the end of the world for my dog to be attacked, by construction, literally anything is better than the end of the world. And so, this feeling popped into my head from this fast thinking cognition that letting my dog be attacked was the worst thing in the world. Anything would be better than that. And so I used this is too distinguished a group for me to repeat the horrible 4-letter, 7-letter, and 12-letter words that I used against my University of Chicago faculty colleague and neighbor in response to this dog charging down the driveway. And, from his perspective, his fast thinking self was engaged in a different sort of cognition. It's called the curse of knowledge, where our theory of mind for other people is, we very quickly assume that other people have in their head exactly what we have in our head. That is our default theory of mind for other people. He knew that this was an accident, that his dog had just slipped the leash. He assumed that I must have known since he knew. And all of a sudden, I'm saying, from his perspective, I'm saying all of these like horrible, profane things, screaming these at him right in front of his house when his wife and little kids were having breakfast inside, right? So from his perspective, he's the good guy. From my perspective, I'm the good guy. And we just start screaming at each other back and forth. And the thing that saved us, which makes, Hyde Park a very well-resourced neighborhood, a forgiving place for these two affluent middle-aged guys engaging in the most embarrassing behavior you can imagine. Like, who knows where this would have ended, except the University of Chicago has a series of unarmed security guards who drive around the neighborhood all the time patrolling. And one of them happened to drive by, they rolled down the window and said, "Is everything okay here? Or should I call the University of Chicago police?" That is what Jane Jacobs was writing about 60 years ago as Eyes Upon the Street. Adults around the neighborhood who are willing to step in and intervene and deconflict conflict when it happens. And, that winds up explaining why South Shore and Greater Grand Crossing, that's one of the reasons why South Shore and Greater Grand Crossing wind up having such radically different rates of gun violence. South Shore, the economic conditions today are the same, the racial composition today are the same as in Greater Grand Crossing, but South Shore has, by virtue of the accident of history, it's located right along the lake, one of the most amazing parts of Chicago, the Chicago lakefront on Lake Michigan. Because of that accident, it has lots more stores and restaurants and other sort of commercial stuff developed, interspersed among, residential houses and apartment buildings. That means that there are more people walking around in South Shore, out in public places, to intervene when young people are engaged in arguments and try and help de-escalate these things. Jane Jacobs noticed back in the 1960s that explained why different neighborhoods in New York that were similar sociodemographically had such different rates of crime. I think that that's an important part of the explanation for what's going on with South Shore and Greater Grand Crossing, and highlights something about these neighborhoods that's much easier to change through public policy than these really hard to change root causes like racial segregation and poverty and that sort of stuff.
Well, I thank you for your willingness of self-disclosure. I thought the anecdote that you described, and that's not the only one, by the way, that you admit in your book, but I think
it's much more embarrassingly portrayed in the book, much more embarrassingly portrayed, if I may say.
And I just will add to the audience, the only part that you didn't elaborate on was the fact that you had earbuds in your ear and you were actually publishing live to your criminal lab colleagues who were witnesses to the whole thing. Is that correct?
And they've never looked at me the same way twice.
I suspect that we have many folks in the audience from various walks of life, but it's probably fair to assume that most are connected in some way to the justice system in general and the criminal justice system in particular. Judges, probation officers, parole officers, criminal justice advocates, and perhaps mental health professionals that work in the system. So here's where I'd like to talk about what I meant at the outset, that your book contains multitudes. It so starkly reveals how predictable the lack of what I'll call impulse control is. It can almost be referred to as predictable human nature. And to tee up my next question, I need to make a shift to it is now a highly successful preventative public safety policy adopted throughout Europe that looks like chasing and punishing people after the harm has already occurred to be a fail. So in the United States, over 40,000 people are killed every year by or while driving in an automobile. Some of this is a result of bad behavior that we've decided to call criminal, DUI, reckless driving, etc., because we attach some characterological bad person tag on that kind of person because of the behavior. All the others we call, quote, accidents, because we choose not to include elderly ladies or perhaps young learners as an other, or believe that he or she could have been me. But the tragic result is exactly the same. The streets and highways in America are incredibly unsafe. So countries in Europe years ago began to develop an evidence-based policy that they now refer to as zero vision driving that acknowledges such likely and predictable human behavior. It understands that you're not likely to threaten or punish your way to automobile safety, So it is deemed the responsibility of the system itself, the government, if you will, to design their roads, their highways, to enforce speed limits, etc. So when the inevitable bad judgment, the system one judgment, the negligent behavior, which is absolutely predictable, when it occurs, it will not likely result in a death or a terrible injury. So you've spoken about Jane Jacobs as the type of interveners that exist in our communities that perhaps can prevent the first bad act. But as judges and criminal justice partners, we have literally a captive audience in a system where so much crime, violent crime, is perpetrated by repeat offenders. So I could recall sentencing easily over a dozen people a month who stood convicted of a violent or serious crime. I could have sent them all to state prison for 2 years, fully satisfying the role that I responsibly play in the system, knowing that over 60% of those released in California are going to commit another crime within 3 years of their release. Or couldn't I have intervened to prevent the next one? So we've talked a little bit, you and I have, about the unforgiving places and the type of interveners that you identified. But as to the justice system audience that we have, I mean, literally, we have about as much power, if you will, to intervene systemically to prevent the next bad thing. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe what I would, I agree. Let me, one of the other big sort of light bulb moments for me in my thinking about the problem of gun violence in America came with, we were doing a project in the juvenile detention center here in Chicago on the west side of the city. And I was talking to a staff member there, and he said, this is his words now, right? So he said to me, he said, I think 20% of the kids in here are psychopaths. You let them out, they're going to hurt other people. They've just got to be in here. And that speaks to the idea that we do need a criminal justice system. Some people do need to be locked up. This is his view. But he's saying the other 80% of the kids in here, I always tell them, if I could give you back just 10 minutes of your lives, none of you would be here. And I think it's the fact that there are both types of people out there and the proportions may be a little bit different from what you might have thought, I think was a real revelation to me. And then it raises, Judge, your good point, which is like, if you were a judge, what might you do? And I think for starters, it becomes incredibly important to think about which type of person you have in front of you. Do you have one of the 20% who are psychopath, or do you have one of the 80% who made a bad decision in a 10-minute window? And if it's the sort of person who made a bad decision in a 10-minute window, what does one do about that? And I think, one of the things that we've learned over time from behavioral economics is, the fact that these sorts of fast-thinking mistakes that lead to violence are so common across all of us. We have learned something over time from behavioral economics about how to help people recognize these tendencies and avoid them. Like, we know how to teach people about their own tendency to catastrophize and avoid doing it when they're in a heated argument with somebody else, kind of thing. And, in fact, the reason that I was in the juvenile detention center is because we were working with the administrator of the juvenile detention center here to deploy and study a program, one of these behavioral economics programs that was delivered by the detention staff in the afternoon to the kids. They used to just sit in the common room all day, every afternoon, watching TV as the detention guard stood against the wall watching the kids watch TV. And the administrator said, I think we can probably come up with something that's more developmentally productive than that. And so it worked with the detention center to implement this program. It was basically free. He's got the guards already. He's got the facility. He's got the inmates. They're literally a captive audience. And we saw something like a 20% reduction in recidivism rate by the set of kids that the juvenile justice system think are at the highest risk for violence involvement. A 20% reduction in recidivism for basically free, right? The cost of this was just like the cost of printing up the booklets for the program, as free as you get in the criminal justice system. Like, give me 5 things that reduce recidivism by 20% and each are free. I think we're really onto something. And so I think like that's one type of thing that I think criminal justice practitioners could really start thinking about, which is where can we infuse. Here's another way to think about this, Judge, if I may. In the city of Chicago, the city that I know best, 90% of the shooters and 80% of the shooting victims have a prior arrest record. Almost everybody involved in gun violence in Chicago was in our care, our, collectively speaking, the criminal justice system. We had them at some point with us. We had the chance to do something developmentally productive to steer them onto a different path. And by construction, we missed it because they showed up at a shooting scene either dead or in handcuffs, right? And I think these sorts of behavioral economics program that even existing detention staff can deliver, probation, parole, detention staff, even health teachers in public school settings, right? I think there are lots and lots of opportunities to diffuse this stuff in settings that are working with people right now that can basically be free and be very effective in helping people themselves learn. It's not just external interruption, as in my case, where the security guard stepped in, but also self-interruption, recognizing the sort of mistakes that you're prone to and helping you step in and turn things in a different direction yourself.
In preparing for this conversation, I talked about your book with a number of my friends and colleagues, and it became clear to me how to personalize the power of what you so deftly describe and articulate. To the best of my knowledge, most of my friends haven't had an experience personally with pulling out a handgun to settle an argument on the streets of Los Angeles or San Francisco. But if there's almost a universal experience in what is commonly tossed around as a version of road rage, that floods almost instant anger and adrenaline that results in that, quote, who does something so dangerous, so careless, so selfish, while your spouse or children are in the car, that causes you to do something almost regrettable. I think everyone I know identifies somewhat with that. But for most, other than instantly blurting out, I think you referred to at least a 12-letter word, a swear word, the impulse to violently react subsides quickly thereafter without resulting harm. But not for the 50 or so or more people that I can recall standing in front of me over the years, charged with some version of felonious road rage behavior. And most of that involved a gun. And so that road rage response is, in my mind, predictable human behavior. We know that if you drive, it's likely to happen. We know that a measurable number of people that you have already identified carry a handgun, perhaps with a permit, in their cars. I carefully listened to victims of violent crimes over the years and asked them over and over what they wanted to see. And there's some exceptions, but almost everyone answers, I just never want this to ever happen to me or to someone else again. You are a social scientist of significant renown. You undoubtedly know well dozens of colleagues and other scientists who are relied upon so policies relating to anything from climate change, the economy, to medicine can be evidence-based. But why is it when it comes to the causes and conditions experienced by victims of violent crime, public safety, the criminal justice system, we already seem to know all we need to know?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question about why criminal justice policy has not been more evidence-based historically. And I think, I'm only guessing here or hypothesizing, but I wonder if part of the answer is that too much of these policy questions have been viewed through the lens of, it's almost been framed as like moral questions or political questions rather than pragmatic questions about what is actually going on here. If one were to rise above the politics of the day and rise above one's antipathy to people on the other side of the political aisle and just rise above the politics and look at the fact patterns that we see here, what would we be seeing? I think that is something that I think is increasingly difficult for everybody in this hyperpolarized moment. And I think criminal justice in particular has really been put in a moral frame, which I think is just not conducive to understanding what's going on. Because once you put something in a moral frame, it's very hard not to engage in what's called motivated reasoning, to sort of cherry pick the facts that fit with your moral view rather than be open to facts that point in a different direction and might change your mind. But that's a guess. I think it's a great question about, and I think it's sorely needed. Like if you look at medicine, medicine has done medicine has become really, really evidence-based. It's certainly not perfect, but relative to other fields, it's become really evidence-based. And we've seen life expectancy around the world double since 1900. In contrast, the murder rate in the United States today on a per capita basis is almost exactly the same as it was in 1900, right? This sort of 125 years of political arguing and moralizing has led to no progress. And so I hope that we can start thinking about this as sort of a pragmatic, factual type issue and follow the data rather than sort of follow our political moral leanings.
If the system, if the criminal justice system has the power, and I believe that it surely does, back to this issue of designing the system as opposed to reacting to the last thing and chasing it to prevent the next gun violent crime, whether it's on the streets of Chicago or a road rage incident in California from happening. Does anybody really believe that sending this identifiable group of 50 people to state prison for 2 years and then saying, well, I did my job, it's done, as opposed to comparing them with another cohort of 50 people where that judge knows something about I'll call it cognitive behavioral therapy. I got to be careful not to get outside my lane in terms of what I know and I don't know. But over the years, as conditions of probation and suspending sentences, I required hundreds of people to participate in some type of behavioral modifying therapy. And I don't have the data. If I did, I would share it with you. But every fiber in my being tells me that if I compare those two cohorts, the ones that are sent to state prison recidivate at 60% over 3 years. And in the alternative courts, the courts that we've established as alternatives to the punitive response, their success rates are almost always 90% plus. And so we've done this. We know this, yet we keep doing it the same way and then complaining about the headline of the crime that occurred in South Chicago last week.
Right. Well, I mean, if I can add to that, Judge, I think like you are, I think the data that I've seen and the data that we've generated in Chicago very much supports your conjecture that, I would call things like cognitive behavioral therapy, moral recognition therapy, all of those, I think, are part of this behavioral economics view of what's going on. All of those programs are basically getting people to be more reflective of their own thinking, to recognize that they're doing a lot below the level of consciousness, be aware of it, and be more skeptical of what your fast thinking self is sort of popping into your head, is how I think about all of that working. And I think the thing that I want to really, and I think I see this question pop up in the chat, restorative justice, I think, is doing the same sort of thing, right? So restorative justice is another way to get people to reflect on their own thinking. I think there are lots of paths to success here, right? But the key is that you actually have to proactively do something, right? Which is to say, like, one of the things that I see a lot of around the country is like, we don't like prison, so we're going to do nothing, right? We're going to like divert someone from prison and hope they never show up again. And like, not doing prison is not sufficient, right? Like, you need to, like, in the same way that sending someone to prison does not help them better understand what got them into this place, just turning them loose back to the community with nothing else also does not help them learn anything about what got them to their place. And so I really applaud your proactive efforts to get people into this place where they can sort of reverse engineer what got them into trouble and learn how to avoid that in the future, which I think is just so absolutely critical, right? It can't just be not doing this other thing. It's got to be proactively doing something sort of constructive.
Well, this may get out somewhat from the major thesis of your book, but if you know as a scientist and people in my position over 30 years of actually doing it every day, know you get better outcomes in terms of reducing the next crime. You actually, it's almost not comparable. Why aren't the players in the system held responsible for their unacceptable outcomes, I guess is what I'm saying. You compared it to medicine. If you had two surgeons and one was doing it a certain way and the other one was doing another way, and one's outcomes were 50% better than the other, somebody would step in and say, wait a minute, we need to fix this because it's doable, but surgeon B isn't doing it. If I have two judges and one sends everybody to prison and the other judge is willing to engage deep, find out what's happening, and send this person to a program that's designed to meet their analyzed professional needs, and the results are 50% better, you've, by my hypothetical, reduced the next violent crime by 50%.
Yeah, but I think, Judge, you're putting your finger on something very important, but I would point out that, like, I just want to remind you, like, the survey data show that most Americans have this conventional wisdom that the cause of gun violence and crime is, rational calculating behavior, and the only solution is either carrots or sticks. And I suspect that is what if that's what most Americans think, I would be very surprised if that's not what most Americans who work in the American criminal justice think as well, because they are part of American society as well. And if that's your view of the determinants of crime and gun violence, you are going to look at these sorts of programs and think that they are a distraction, right? And I think partly what I hope the book will do is get more people to realize that this other way of thinking about the determinants and the causes of the problem are really important and really useful, to like introduce a third kind of conventional wisdom into the conversation that helps people see, like, cognitive behavioral therapy, it's not ending poverty in America, and it's not punishing people more strictly. So most people are looking at this thinking this is just a dumb waste of time. And I think the book is trying to argue there's another way to see the problem, and it makes sense in that perspective. Denise has come on, which makes me think that we're at the Q&A session.
I was going to say that I know your book includes a chapter, I think it's entitled "A Reason or a Cause for Hope," and I want to make sure we we leave on that note. But I did promise the audience that we would set aside some time here in the 15 minutes or so we have for any questions. Denise or Justin, did you want to introduce the questions?
Thank you. First, when you have a chance to read the chat, it is basically a fan club meeting. But let's turn to Liz Fester first. She's brave enough to agree to unmute. So please let us know your question.
Hi, my name's Liz. I am zooming in from Canada, actually, Hamilton, Ontario specifically. We are a small grassroots agency that's working to reduce gun violence using a community violence intervention model. But what we've seen is with this really strong uptick in gun crime, specifically in Hamilton in the last 2 years, the lack of municipal buy-in for some policy change and lack of municipal buy-in to attach some dollars to violence reduction beyond kind of that prevention widespread space. Noting that, another basketball program after school isn't gonna necessarily reduce gun crime and homicide. And I'm curious from your lens, what you think is a good pathway in terms of getting municipal counselors on side, not just to attach dollars, but to attach time and resources to kind of continue this conversation. And unfortunately, in our municipality, start this conversation.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think I don't know the Canadian. I obviously don't know, or maybe not obviously. Like I've been in the United States since I was 3, so this is the context that I know. And I think the most salient feature of the policy context in the U.S. is that everybody is flat broke. Like almost every city or every city in the United States is broke because the economics of downtowns have fundamentally changed after the pandemic. Federal pandemic relief is going away. Every state in America has some like horrible unfunded public sector pension problem. And I'm not giving away any secrets to say the federal government is not going to be shipping money to cities and states to solve problems like gun violence anytime soon. And so like I could personally see the argument for lots of very high return investments, but that's just a very tough sell. If you're a policymaker and you're thinking, which program should I cut? Food stamps or maternal and child health or the fire department or the whatever, you see these are like excruciating cuts. And when someone comes along and says, like, I want more money for something else, you're like, you are just not reading the room and seeing the problem that I'm facing. So that has led me, this is why I was saying in my conversation with Judge Alldredge, like that has gotten me to really think very, very seriously about how do you solve this problem, taking seriously the budget constraint that policymakers are operating under, which is I have $0. And that's why I mentioned the juvenile detention center study that we did, right? Like every jail has guards. Every juvenile detention center has guards. Every prison has guards. And you have a bunch of inmates, and those inmates are at super elevated risk for future crime and violence involvement. And you have them, if they're in jail, you have them for a month or two. If they're in prison, you have them for a year or two, or sometimes longer, right? And we are doing almost nothing to a first approximation in most criminal justice systems that I know, almost nothing that would really help people avoid crime and violence involvement when they get out. Train your guards and your detention staff to deliver CBT. Is it going to be the best social program in the history of social policy? No. Is it something that you can do basically for free? Yes. Is it going to materially make a difference? I think all the data that I have seen suggests the answer is yes. That is something that you can do at super low cost, and you could start doing it yesterday. So that to me would be one of the highest priority things, that the low-hanging fruit in the criminal justice system that you can do in a world in which, unfortunately, we are operating under these extraordinarily, maybe Canada is in a slightly better position, but if you were anything like the United States, I think that budget constraint really is, as well-intentioned as policymakers are, they really are in a tough bind themselves.
Thank you. And thank you, Liz, for jumping in. So one participant who hasn't had the opportunity yet, and that's the key, yet to read the book, wonders if in your research you were able to review the documentary, The Feminists on cell block Y, and whether or not you have, wonders how much you attribute gun violence to masculine norms, patriarchal beliefs.
Yeah, I have unfortunately not had a chance to review that, so I'm very grateful for the recommendation. You know, the question is very interesting because the very first sort of behavioral economics program that we studied here in Chicago was developed by a nonprofit here called Youth Guidance, and the program was called Becoming a Man. And I think what it or BAM, Becoming a Man, and what it speaks to is this idea that, like, one of the things that your subconscious self develops is a bunch of assumptions that you deploy automatically about how you're supposed to behave based on your gender. And most people don't even realize that they've developed those assumptions. And I think that's an example of the type of thing that these behavioral economics programs can help surface for people and help them critically examine. And, you know, for those sorts of automatic responses that are not helpful to them, to recognize it and move past them.
Thank you. Thank you. And I feel like I'm doing a rapid fire quiz, but you're doing very well on the rapid fire quiz. How many homicides are the product of gun proliferation?
Yeah, I think there is no, so, you know, in my hometown of Chicago, I think for 2024, if I remember the statistics correctly, 88% of the murders in Chicago involved firearms. That's your answer right there, right? I mean, maybe it's a little bit lower in other American cities, but like that gives you a sense for the scale of the importance of gun proliferation. But this goes back to Judge Alldredge's question before, which is like, what are we going to do about the 400 million guns in the foreseeable future? The guns are not going anywhere, and federal gun policy is not changing anytime soon. So it's clear that gun proliferation is an important part of the problem. That doesn't mean that reversing that is within the feasible set in the short term. Again, for better or for worse, depending on your politics, right? And so what I'm trying to focus on in the book is what are things that we can feasibly do starting tomorrow that would actually make a difference. And it's changing the willingness of people to use guns to hurt one another, which is not to disagree that gun proliferation is not an important part of the challenge here.
Thank you. It's a shame you didn't pick a trickier political area to work in. And then I think our final question, totally want to end with hope. What are the things that we can all do right now to turn these thoughts into action? You've mentioned some of them, but tell us more about your favorites, please.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, the most important one, as I just said, is like diffusing behavioral economics programs or cognitive behavioral therapy, whatever you want to call them, anywhere you can within the criminal justice system. I think would be really just a game changer, and it can be done at close to zero cost. I think the one other thing that I would mention, this might feel like it's cutting a little bit against, you know, what I just said about the 400 million guns not going anywhere, is the other key, I think the other really, really important key fact about gun violence in America is that the overwhelming majority of it happens in public places, which is to say that gun carrying in public, often illegal gun carrying in public, is a very important proximate contributor. Like, you can see, if you believe my argument that most shootings stem from arguments, and most murders in America involve guns, you can sort of see the picture here that you get is it's people out in public getting into arguments. There's a gun at hand out in a public place, and tragedy ends. So behavioral economics, cognitive behavioral therapy, violence interrupters will all reduce the chances that conflict escalates. But anything that we can do, we can't get rid of the 400 million guns, but we can do things to try and keep those guns off the streets. And I think anything that you can do to help keep guns off the streets would be disproportionately useful. And I think the part of that I am particularly worried about now is coming with some changes that we are seeing in firearm technology on the streets of Chicago and other American cities, with the growing proliferation of high-capacity magazines and machine gun conversion devices. You know, I was just in the Chicago Police Department training center 2 weeks ago, where they did a demonstration of what a semi-automatic and an assault rifle look like when you add a machine gun conversion device, and it is chilling. And I've been in Southside Chicago police stations when the cops come in with a 16-year-old kid who's got a semi-automatic handgun that's been turned into a machine gun with a Glock switch and a 100-round drum. And that is the sort of thing that turns an argument that in the United Kingdom leads to a black eye, a machine gun conversion device, a semi-automatic handgun, and a 100-round drum turns that into a recipe for a mass shooting. And anything that you criminal justice practitioners can do to really, really get those machine gun conversion devices and high-capacity magazines off the streets would be like doing God's work in trying to reduce the public health and public safety consequences of these, of what is a very, very common human form of interaction, which is conflict.
To say that
Go
I'm
ahead.
grateful for this conversation is to vastly understate. But Judge Alldredge, what did you want to say? Forgive me.
No, I was just noticing that we are nearing our time limit. I want to respect the time of all the people who have taken some space out of their busy lives to listen to this conversation. As I said, this book is profound. I've read it twice. It is Unforgiving Places, the unexpected origins of American gun violence. This is the cool graphic that I was mentioning to you. If you haven't been to Chicago, you get some idea of what and where Professor Ludwig lives and teaches, and the neighborhoods that he describes. Professor, I think you have contributed a significant work for those of us who really do want to try something other than the manifestly unsuccessful approach to criminal justice that most of us keep butting our heads up against over and over again. On behalf of BJI, I thank you so much for taking time out of your day and busy schedule for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much again for having me, and thank you all for what you're trying to do to make things better.
Thanks all around. Thanks to my colleague Justin. Thanks to our two spectacular faculty, not just one, Judge Alldredge. I noticed the way you just tried to deflect. I suspect book sales will be on the rise. Fascinating topics, but special thanks to all who joined us today. We're grateful.